Good evening. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for helping celebrate a wonderful man, a wonderful husband, father, professional, your friend, and his 70th birthday. Wow, right? Hope I make it. What we're going to do tonight is talk a little about Pemon and things that you might not know about him. And I'll start with this treasure here on the table of photographs. This photograph, have you seen it? Mom and Dad.
Well, first of all, the picture was taken on one of their dates at the Club de Lisa, which was one of the most famous nightclubs in Chicago. And I've always treasured that picture and have kept it. My mother was from Jackson, Mississippi. My father was from Oklahoma. His family originally from Louisiana. They met in Chicago at the Thin Shell Candy Company. They were making peppermint candy. He was making the red, she was making the white. There was a window between them. And he told the guy he was working with, when he saw her walk in, that that was going to be his wife. And they ultimately got married. But I treasured watching the relationship that they had and how he took care of her.
We're near the end of her life, is what you say?
Throughout the whole life. She never drove, for example. And she never drove because he always picked her up. He picked her up from work, he took her to work whenever she worked. She didn't have to drive. He was her chauffeur in that sense. A lot of ultimately what I became is a reflection of my father. He was solid. He was one of the few people that I knew that knew how to do everything. You know, he repaired our stereo. He built a refrigerator. He would do his car.
So he was your first Renaissance man in your life.
He was, and someone asked me once, did I want to be like my father? And I said, no, I want to be in a position where I can hire somebody like my father. Because there was no way in the world that I thought I could compete with his level of knowledge. And it wasn't from a strict education, it was from experience.
So what do you remember most about Mom?
I remember her singing. And she had a Diana Washington kind of voice. And so as a child, I just remember her singing every morning and listening to Sarah Vaughan and Joe Williams, Diana Washington, and she would play them every morning.
So maybe subliminally, you were getting a lot of your artistic flavor as a young fellow with all that music in the house.
Yeah, that, and I found out at my father's funeral, and not until then, that he was an artist when he was young, but was discouraged from it, so he never talked about it. And even though my older brother, Harold, was an artist, he didn't know either.
So what kind of artist are we talking about?
A artist, a drawer. He drew. He figures, animals, people. He was an artist. But during that period of time, it wasn't considered a serious career as a possibility. So he shoved it to the back, and he tried, in some ways, discouraged us from considering a field in the arts until I became rather known around Chicago, and then he changed his opinion of me from that.
Now, let's look around and see what else I can pull up. How about this photograph, and what are we looking at?
That is me on the left and a gentleman named Jerome. That was our Little League baseball team, the Rockets, when we lived in Stateway Gardens. And I originally really wanted to be a baseball player. I had every intention of doing that as a child, and I was very good at it, except I was left-handed. And there's some limitations of left-handed people. You can only play certain positions, and ultimately I wasn't tall enough and strong enough in terms of my arm to be a pitcher. But we won a number of trophies and city championships as a child. And it also taught me about teamwork. I've been on jobs where people have said, you're not a team player. And I've responded by saying, I'm an exact team player because I play baseball and I know what my position is. In baseball, it teaches you that you play first base. Now you cover second. You cover the pitcher. but you play your position. And you understand the relationship of positions. And so I've taken that throughout my life and used it as a methodology for determining how I work with people and what I do.
Thank you. We're learning some things we didn't know. I'm going to grab this one because I know this photograph comes from a time when you made quite an impact in Chicago theater.
Yeah, I started in theater primarily because of a show I saw by Oscar Brown Jr. and Okoro Harold Johnson when I was in high school. I saw this show that was called Lyrics of Sunshine and Shadows, and it starred the Spencer Jackson family, the original Jacksons, and I was mesmerized by it as a musical, and it was around the work of Paul Laurence Dunbar. And when I saw this show, I said, that's what I wanted to do. Now, I had been playing music. I started as a musician, you know, in high school. I played part of a percussion group. We were really very good at that as well. But when I saw that show, I said, well, no, I'd rather do musicals. So I started to create shows centered around that. I would get a job washing pots at Montgomery Ward's or at Papa Milano's or any kind of restaurant, and I would then take the money after working for a few days, and I would go rent a theater at 8th and Wabash, and I would buy the costumes, and I'd get the actors together, and I started putting my shows on. Wow. And I was 16, 17 at the time, and it became part of what my life ultimately became. That picture with you and me is part of a show that you directed at a theater that I found on the west side of Chicago, the Montezino Theater. And this was a show called The Strong Breed. It was the first African production to be done in Chicago. It was written by Wole Soyinka, and you directed it. And we built this African village in this theater on the west side.
And you continued your producing on this.
And I produced that one, yeah. And so that's what that's from. Yeah.
Well, I want to, as I look around this table and see all these fine things we could talk about, I'd like for you to answer this question for me. What would you say was the single most incident in your life that impacted your life the most?
My response would be my car accident. I had directed a production of Guys and Dolls in Kalamazoo, Michigan. We were living in Phoenix at the time, and I flew back to Phoenix. You were directing a production of, I believe, Bubbling Brown Sugar, or 8 Minutes for Haven. It was 8 Minutes for Haven at the time. And I decided to go buy a gallon of paint to paint this reception area for the party that we were going to have opening night, and never made it to the store. I had a head-on collision with a truck, broke my leg in 5 different places, the fibula twice, the tibia twice, and the ankle. Ended up being on crutches for 3 years. But it changed my life in a different way because it was the advent of the computer, and I was forced to sit down. And because I was forced to sit down, it gave me the opportunity to learn everything that there was about computers. And I learned all of the software, I learned everything about technology. And so by the time I got off crutches, I was able to take over an $18 million production facility that had just been built in Phoenix. It was the Leadership Development Center that the YWCA had built. It had satellite uplink, downlink, multi-camera studio. It was a training and leadership development center. But I had learned so much during that period that when I went into the interview, I knew how to work most of the things that were there and was able to run that for about 5 years.
I found that time in your life quite phenomenal because it was such a hard and difficult task to rebuild your health. And in that process of rebuilding your health, you never lost your ambition.
I didn't, and
well, I know there were times where it was difficult and hard and your ups and downs, but generally speaking, overall,
I never felt that it was over. I never felt it was over. And so even when I applied for the job, I was still on I think I was on a
cane
at the time.
Yes. Well, you were on crutches.
I was on crutches, but then
you put them away and went in on a cane. I remember that for the job interview.
And interviewed, and then in my first few weeks there, I was actually on an IV. And I had to take the bag and hook it up in between. Antibiotics, yeah. And so I would go into my office and I would close the door and I would hang the bag up and I would do my IV. And then I would go back, and nobody knew. They didn't know the whole time that I was there.
Let me just drop this in. Nobody knew because it wasn't pertinent to what your responsibilities were on the job. And it wasn't affecting your ability to do the job well. I just want to relate that to us being married.
You know, we've worked together longer than we've been married. And I think people have always felt that our work relationship was extremely solid. I remember when I first took on the position at the DuSable Museum of African American History as the Director of Education and Public Programs, one of the staff members there told me, because I wanted to hire you for a project, and they said, well, you can't hire her. She's your wife. I said, well, no, you need to look at her credentials. And he said, well, no, we can't do it. I said, okay, look at it this way. I've been working with you for 4 weeks. I've been working with her for 40 years. Who do you think I'm going to choose to work with? So if you don't think that she can work with us, then I'm not going to be working here. And it had nothing to do with anything other than proficiency.
Well, I'm glad they looked at my resume,
Yeah,
because I was hired, the project went well, and we moved along.
Okay.
We might be jumping around a little bit.
Guys, Blues Brothers.
Look at this shot.
That is our son with Cab Calloway. In the scene from Blues Brothers, I had the great fortune of being able to do the casting for Blues Brothers and Mahogany and Cooley High and Uptown Saturday Night and 14 other films during that period of time. And just a little quick anecdote as to how that happened. I had done The Spook Who Sat by the Door. Sam Greenlee, who was an incredible writer, called me one day and he said, look, I wrote this role for you, Shorty Duncan, and I want you to do the role in the film. And so I did the film, and when I got back from California shooting it, I get a call from an agent, Shirley Hamilton. Shirley says to me, I need you to come and be an extra on a film. I said, extra? I just got back from doing a starring role. I'm not going to play it. So anyway, so she convinced me to be an extra on this film. And she says Isaac Hayes is in it. And so I go out, I'm the extra, I'm standing on the corner. Isaac Hayes walks by. And he stops and he asks me, does he know me? He had seen an advanced version of Spook Who Sat by the Door and had recognized me from the film. And we became pretty close, you know, during a couple of more days that we shot. So when they leave and they wrap, I get a call after that from Mahogany and Cooley High that I was referred by Isaac Hayes to Berry Gordy as a person that they might want to work with when they came to Chicago.
Now you have a fabulous memory. That's one of the things I admire about you. So your memory is fantastic, but you also are smart enough to understand how important it was to document.
Yeah.
And so this right here, I wanted to share with everyone this evening.
I had the great fortune of getting a call to consider becoming the director of that theater. And I initially had said no because I was going out to California. I was still doing film. I was doing some television and radio stuff. And I said no. And I went to California to do Spook Who Sat by the Door. And when I came back, found out that the majority of the staff, the principal staff, had been killed in a plane crash. When they called me and they told me that all these people had died, I said, well, I don't want to come into a place following a lot of deaths. And then I thought about it a little more, and I said, well, you know, there won't be anybody there to tell me what to do. You know, I'll have free reign over the theater. And I did. I was able to build the theater, build the stage, put the lighting in. That's the Better Boys Foundation building, yeah. And by the way, you're holding the album that we did of the musical, The Black Fairy, which was about a little black fairy that didn't have any magic. And she went to Johnny's house, and Johnny said, well, you know, white fairies have magic, so, you know, how you go help me? And she goes on a trip throughout history. And she discovers that her magic is herself. It's her and her total being. It's ancient Egypt. It's the Middle Passage. It's all of it. And she goes back and she gives him the strength of believing in himself. Exactly.
I love this shot. And I know it wasn't planned when it was taken, but it has served you well in terms of memory and documentation of men in your life that were mentors to you.
4 of my mentors.
And if I'm not mistaken, every one of them are ancestors now.
They're
The
all
three.
ancestors,
Yeah.
yeah. The people in this picture, Keelan Phil Karan, which is on the right, was the founder of the Afro Arts Theater, and in many ways, the founder of Earth, Wind, and Fire. He set the standard for the music that they ultimately ended up playing. And then all the way to my left in this picture is Sam Greenlee. He's holding Baghdad Blues, which is another of his books that he wrote following Fuku Sebellador. It's an incredible shot. My only other two mentors that are not in that picture, that creatively that I would have added, would have been Oscar Brown Jr. and Theodore Ward.
So I've heard some stories about you from your family members, and one of those stories came from Aunt Ethel. Yes, and she would tell me, oh, he's been telling people what to do for a long time. So he was born a director. I would see him in the backyard playing with his other cousins, and he would tell them where to stand, where to go, what to do. So I'm going to ask you, have you known your path since an early child, or how do you think your life evolved the way it did? And why?
I think that sometimes you take a path and then you are pushed in directions that you can either follow or not. In my case, I always knew that I wasn't a person to follow. I didn't know that I was supposed to lead, but I knew that I wasn't supposed to follow. And there's a distinction in that.
I think because maybe you had your own ideas or had many ideas.
I just didn't like being told what to do.
Okay.
You know, I think that had something to do with it. So, but I didn't want to do any of this. I wanted to be a furniture refinisher, which is what my father did. My father was a furniture refinisher. He would take furniture that was burnt up in a fire and he would remodel it and it would look like new, and he would paint it and he'd do the inlay. That's what I wanted to do. But he took my older brother into the business, and I discovered theater and television. And it just happened to be that way. Or I would have been a foreman at a factory telling people what to do. You know, it's kind of, I think, what my nature was. But I do at the same time think that you are obligated to find a course and then to make things happen to help you to get and to keep that course intact. But I just think that my work has always been tied to the need to improve the quality of life, and taking what we have done creatively and making sure that it has a lasting impact.
With our new champion, Stephanie, and a new Mr. X in the person of Pemon Rami. Welcome, Pemon. Good to have you here.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'm a multimedia technology consultant from Chicago. I've been married to my beautiful wife, Masekwa, for over 28 years. I've got 2 wonderful sons and 4 grandchildren.
Wonderful. Well, it's great to have you here.